and the floor is open for questions. And while you're organizing your questions, I'll pose something. That is that when, so recently there's been a lot of attention about duty hour regulations for trainees. The duty hour regulations were put in with the supposition that our house officers were tired. Because they were tired, they were making mistakes, so we had to restrict their duty hours and patient safety would increase. The data is coming out more and more that despite spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars implementing duty hour regulations, that we have not added one nanogram of safety to the process. In fact, there may be indications that due to the frequent handoffs, et cetera, we've actually made safety less, and certainly in our surgical specialties, there's talk now of adding post-training sort of transitional fellowships because surgeons are coming out unprepared to go into practice. A proposal was made. You know, we did this without doing any research, right? It was just done. So a proposal was made that says, why don't we let some institutions apply for different ways of doing this, with the goal of saying maybe we ought to study the problem in ways that we might have studied it before we ended up turning the world upside down. I asked the same question to this panel about regulations, about disclosure and conflict of interest. First of all, maybe you can cite the fact that this has, quote unquote, solved the problem. I agree that it creates transparency and may create some extra public confidence. I don't know, I haven't seen the research that suggests that. But I haven't seen lots of work that this has made the world a better place, and I have seen lots of certainly anecdotal reports of physicians withdrawing. Certainly in our specialty, many prominent physicians just saying, I'm not doing this anymore because I'm not going to get branded as a miscreant being on lists of scholars who are supported by industry. Might it be time for us to do some research on this topic to actually try to say, here's the problem, is this particular solution the best way to address the problem, allowing institutions to have some latitude to try new and different ways. Neal, you showed some of the ways that you're trying to do things, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, Neal, can I call on you to answer that?
Yeah, let me make a couple comments. One, going back to the duty hour issue. If you look at the history of patient care problems by house staff, it was not about sleep deprivation and it was not about duty hours. It was about lack of supervision. So the real issue was we put a solution in place that was a solution for a different problem. At the same time, there were all sorts of environmental things that were happening, like electronic health records and this concept that you can't learn by doing alone. You have to have some experience before you go touch patients, all of which makes sense, were happening at the same time. So there was this coalescence of issues that resulted in the duty hour regulations. As you apply it to this situation, I think we need to step back and say, what is the problem that we're trying to fix? And the problem we're trying to fix is preventing undue conflicts, undue relationships that compromise the quality and integrity of the science and therefore the public trust. There are clearly institutions, individuals who have compromised that public trust. They are a small, we hope, small percentage that have resulted in major problems, but they are big problems. And so we need to step back and say, why did those things happen? And how do we then address those problems? Not to necessarily imply that therefore everybody has a conflict of interest that's compromising where we're trying to go. Now, how we get there, I don't know. But we need to step back and say, what is the issue we're really trying to accomplish? And that is to ensure that the kinds of things that are very publicly reported on the front page of the paper don't happen, while at the same time we allow the relationship to pursue in a reasonable and responsible way. And that's the balance. Do we put a solution in place that compromises the integrity and the relationships for the majority in order to address the errors and errors of judgment.
I mean, I call this the shoe bomber effect, right? So one guy gets on a plane and 250 million people are walking around airports barefoot now. And well, at any rate. Bernie, any comments about this?
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of evidence-driven policy. And I think lots of good ideas have all kinds of consequences that were not intended and which aren't necessarily constructive. We don't have that data now, Alan. And we're making policies based on what people think would be a good idea and what seems to them to be reasonable. I think it would be a real shame if 10 years from now we were in the exact same place. The IOM somebody convened another meeting. We said, how are we doing on conflicts of interest? And you heard the same anecdotal stories, narratives, but no data which we could then be translated into better policies. So I think it's overdue to have good research, and I think it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a challenge. How would you characterize and identify and analyze the consequences, good and bad, of the policies we have in place? But I think we need to tackle that. Let me also say that we need to try and address the problem of undue influence and bias more explicitly and more proactively. There is a school of thought that says that the source of money isn't the only or necessarily the most important issue in trying to protect the integrity of research. What about a more robust peer review process before clinical trials start, before some of the translational work is done, so we don't have research done that's so flawed that the results will be uninterpretable to a critical reader? I think we need more explicit standards, guidelines, checklists for what rigorous preclinical, and especially early first-in-human studies and clinical studies, what should be some of the things that we insist on? And just to throw out a couple, if you're going to do a comparative trial, make sure the comparator arm is a reasonable comparison. Don't design a study to have the weakest result in the control arm so the experimental arm looks better. I mean, that may be good in the short term of making your study drug look better, but it's not going to help when it gets to patients. So some of the attention we're now spending on just the disclosure of relationships might be better applied to looking at how to characterize and to remove undue influence and bias.
Let me ask Sally to comment briefly on this topic, and then Neal will come back to you and then go to the microphone.
So I hope, Bernie, I think that's a really great point, and we are, as you know, NCI and NINDS both just had workshops on rigor and looking at some of the things that we do to increase rigor in particular our clinical trials, such as using sample sizes and proper controls and all the other things that we need to do. Yeah, and I think, you know, we're in a position in the government of having put together this regulation with a lack of data, and I think that you in your report, Bernie, recommended that we go after those data again to more empirical research in that area. But given the lack of data, and really we don't want to be in the business of regulating behavior or to regulate motivations that individuals have and not understanding what those behaviors and what motivates people to behave in the way they do, that we went at this as a preventative way. I mean, again, I think not having a true scientific knowledge base on which to work, we went at it the only way we could, which was really the preventative and proactive way. And I hate, Ellen, that I'm now considered along with the shoe bomber, but but the idea is again that we, I think, have tried in the best way we can to give some flexibility in approaches so that we can look at this and see what works. When it comes to a regulation, whether or not in the future we can change the regulation, I certainly think that it's more viable thinking about changing regulations when you have the data to back it up. And I am a true believer in instituting policies based on data. But again, this was a very public and visible activity that required action on our part and on the community's part, and I think we've done it. But yes, I would be interested in any data that we could generate that would help inform this whole issue.
Neal, did you want the last quick comment?
Yeah, just a
They're
quick comment to
they're
follow up on.
stacked
Yeah,
up
I
on
see
the
that.
microphone.
To follow up on Bernie's suggestion, I think we really need to step back and figure out what the role of a conflict of interest advisory group or a group that oversees those responsibilities for faculty has versus the IRBs. And we really need to figure out ways to merge those roles more effectively so that the IRB has the expertise to be able to do the scientific evaluation Bernie suggested, but also the expertise to be able to understand where the conflicts are and how they're managed as part of that whole process. Right now, they're done in parallel, and we need to figure out a way to integrate those more effectively, while at the same time having broad enough scientific expertise to address the issues that Bernie's raised. And I'm not sure we're there yet. I think figuring out that relationship will be critically important to figuring out how to move forward on the science that you're suggesting.
Great. Can we go to the mic? Can you let us know who you are?
Yes, I'm Deborah Runkle at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I have a question for Dr. Cohen. You made a brief reference to using social media as a tool in clinical research. And number one, I want to ask you what you were referring to. And number two, does this raise any new questions about the kinds of relationships we're at this meeting to discuss?
So the use of social media is very preliminary. We're figuring out how to use it most effectively to communicate with patients and their families, and to send data back and forth between the providers and the patients to be able to best understand what's working and what's not, and what data is available in their homes to be able to manage their care. So it's creating a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue between the provider and the patient, including communication of clinical information that the patient may not even be a party to communicating.
Are you using patient registries at all?
This is
Patient-run online?
This is absolutely in its infancy.
Okay.
So we're not using anything at the moment except that we are getting data from devices in the home that are being communicated to the physician.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm Henry Brem, Chief of Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. I think that data is critical, and I think it should be one of the themes of the day. But I would really emphasize the biggest challenge is not getting together data on the people who are players in the system, because that's what we tend to do. Who has NIH funds, who's actually doing these studies, working with companies. Are they or are they not revealing their different relationships, and are there different data systems that show they're revealing it here but not there, and then we can, write papers and show that those, it isn't as transparent as we'd like it to be. I think the real big issue is how many people are we scaring away who are innovative, who have NIH funding, have great ideas, or who are working with companies and have great ideas and just won't play in this arena because it's so hard. I mean, we look at the people who do play in the arena and are very successful by and large, and then the few bad apples that need to be policed out, like the shoe bombers in medical research, and those are clearly bad. But most of them, the ones we look at are the ones who are successful at doing this. I'm much more worried about all the particularly young investigators who just say, no way that do I have the time, energy, or do I want the public exposure and bad impression while I'm trying to get promoted academically, for example, that I'm actually being effectively working with a company. So that's, I think, a much bigger challenge than just merging data banks.
Comments? Yes.
I totally agree with that, but I think that's a researchable question that we should be studying. And, we may have to go do social science research with questionnaires, attitudes, things like that, longitudinal studies of people who enter PhD programs or postdoctoral programs. But that's exactly the kind of data we need to start collecting and then to act on the trends that we find.
Yes, and I think the dichotomy, Bernie, that you pointed out, that there are those who say we've gone too far and need to relax and make mid-course corrections, and there are those who will say we haven't gone nearly far enough, that most of this is hand-waving and got to really crank it up. To the extent that we might say 20% of academic physicians say they will no longer do collaborations with industry because of the stigma attached to it. Some people will look at that as a tragedy, and some would say, great, only 80% to go, and we'll get there. So but I couldn't agree with you more. I think that if one of the things that can come out of this workshop is the sense that we need data, and lots of it, so that we can make these policies work better, that would be a huge step forward. Yes.
Hi, Joe Morgan from the Cleveland Clinic. First of all, let me disclose potential financial conflict of interest. I have $200,000 of medical school debt that I racked up a few years ago. So,
got a loan repayment program for you.
Sally will
At
write you a check before
interest.
you leave today.
But what a treat for me. I'm actually delighted to hear a lot of things that a lot of my colleagues and I feel reinforced, and that the panel is aware of, the duty hour issue. A lot of the best clinical experiences I've gotten have been on call. I know a lot of my colleagues share that same sentiment. It's also a treat for me. Dr. Lowe, your book, Resolving Ethical Dilemmas, was my required ethical text. So it's, yeah. But it's a two-part question that I have, and it I think relates to physicians who are going to be entering practice in the next several years. In all facetiousness aside, I do think it is at least an amplifier for potential conflicts of interest, the astronomical level of debt that we will have at the end of residency, particularly those of us from modest backgrounds. To say that $250,000 by the end of residency, $350,000 of debt is not a potent motivator to make money, I think is kind of, and typically when I mention that to older folks, not necessarily old, but folks a few years older than I, it's kind of dismissed as, oh, well, you'll be fine in a few years. And, you know, with so much uncertainty in medicine, I think that amplifies it further. But two questions. Dr. Cohen, you mentioned in medical schools, and I did see this as well in my medical school, the kind of movement to any financial relationship with anyone should be just completely severed. And my question for you is, what are things that specifically are being done and or that you've thought of to kind of introduce the idea of what you were saying in your talk, essentially that, you know, this is kind of a working relationship to develop, you know, new things for patients. And then the second question that I have for Dr. Rockey is in relation to young investigators and what are the things that we're doing to kind of support them? Because I think oftentimes there's a lot of creativity that gets lost after decades in practice. And I think the situation that we're in healthcare right now requires creativity. And what are things that we're doing to help foster younger clinicians?
Well, let me take the first question, which is about what we're doing to address the issue of resident medical student education. We've done a terrible job as an academic profession at educating medical students and residents about the value of the relationships with industry, the importance of the value of the relationships, and the challenges associated with the relationships. We have said, as a result of some of those outliers, that you can't have an industry representative telling you how to prescribe a drug, you can't get any pens or pencils because it's going to influence your behavior, all of which may be appropriate, but we haven't put it in context at all. We've just gone from one extreme to the next, just like we did with duty hours. We didn't scientifically evaluate it, and we didn't incrementally educate people. So what we're trying to do is engage in dialogue, just like this, with medical students, with residents, talking about how we can manage the situation, how we can optimize their educational experience, and at the same time recognize the value of the relationships and the pitfalls that are associated with them. So until we go back to the basics and talk about what we're trying to accomplish in thinking about industry-academic relationships and then how to most effectively accomplish them, we won't have done our duty.
So thanks for the question, and again, all kidding aside, we do have a loan repayment program for clinician scientists, and we can pay up to $35,000 of your debt each year. So keep that in mind. But I just want to start out by saying the plight of the new investigator is not lost on us. It's a really important area for us. We've been working on it for years and years. We just finished a year-long study on the future of the biomedical workforce, but we concentrated on PhD. So one of the things we're doing now is doing another really in-depth study on clinician scientists. So we're going to try to learn that. And one of the things we learned about PhDs is not only the length of time and that it takes you to get a PhD, but that we're training them to go in one direction where the majority of them don't end up in academia, but that's how we're training them to be academic scientists. We have other programs that first of all, one of the problems right now for everybody in NIH, and particularly of concern for the new investigator, is just our pay lines. Our pay lines are so low. We're looking at maybe a 15% success rate. You know that the pay lines at many of our institutes are even lower than that. So we have always promoted new investigators to comprise at least about a quarter to a third of our workforce at any given time. And so we have programs available to them that give them basically extra credit should they be an early stage investigator within 10 years of their terminal degree, which could include residency, to come in the programs. We are extraordinarily concerned about clinician scientists. We see the number of MDs in particular, although the number of MD PhDs is rising, the number of MDs in our programs as principal investigators has been going down. So we take a look at our K programs, which are our transition programs. We're taking a look at our new investigator programs, and I think this study that we're going to do will inform us about the whole workforce as a whole in the as clinicians, and see what we need to do about it to bolster it. Because one of the interesting things we found is that while the number of PIs, MDs that are PIs has gone down, we still have about the same amount of MDs participating in our project. So why is that? Why is it that they're not principal investigators? Is it just the ability to balance their time and be able to have the freedom to do the research as a PI? What is it that's causing this change here? But we're very concerned about the early stage investigator, and we want to do everything we can because the pipeline is all we got. The future is all we got, so we got to keep it strong.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes. Hi, I'm Danny Carlat. I'm the director of the prescription project for the Pew Charitable Trusts and also UCSF grad. I know there's a couple of UCSF grads on the panel, or deans. And also a psychiatrist, so I represent one of the professions that has been slammed by, as they call them, Grassley-Grams over the last few years. Letters from Senator Grassley requesting information about financial relationships. I guess I had one comment, and then there were a couple of pieces of research that I'm aware of recently that bear on the issue of the effects of policies on behavior. The comment is that I don't believe that many of the critics that are referred to by Dr. Cohen and others are saying that there should be a complete separation, right? I mean, we're talking really about separating pharmaceutical marketing from the medical education component, and I think that's really what I consider in prescription project consider to be very important, and I think most of us probably would agree with that. But we do believe that industries should be involved in academia and research. And the other thing, in terms of studies, there have been two recent studies, not necessarily the best studies in the world, but one of them very recently out of JAMA Internal Medicine. These are both retrospective studies looking at the effect of exposure of medical students to gift bans in medical school on their later prescribing. And both of these studies were consistent, and they showed that there is an effect. There's an effect on prescribing behavior, and that effect is less prescribing of the newer medications that are of only marginal improvement or benefit over older medications. For example, Vyvanse over amphetamine, or Invega over risperidol. Those are both psychiatric drugs. So, as I said, these aren't the best studies in the world, but I think we're beginning to see some evidence coming out that, yes, there is an effect of conflict of interest policies in the academic medical environment on later prescribing behavior, and then one can argue about whether decreased prescribing of brand name and increased prescribing of generics is a good thing or not, and that's going to vary from field to field and drug to drug.
Comments? Or I think your point is well taken. Some of the issues of education, marketing disguised as education, are things that we need to pay attention to, and those things I think have been appropriately singled out for concentrated effort.
Guy Chisholm, Cleveland Clinic. I'll be talking this afternoon a little bit about what one can do inside an academic medical center to make the balance between conflict of interest and innovation work better. But I came to the microphone to respond to something that Neal said about the need for seamless communication between the IRB and the conflict of interest programs. And at the clinic, I've tried to put around the table in the conflict of interest committee the voices in our institution who should be determining our institutional tolerances for industry relationships and what those should be. And that includes the interpretation of things like the NIH regulations. But one of the things we've done is we put the head of the IRB, and in fact another top administrator from the IRB, as voting members of the conflict of interest committee. And as you suggested, this has been a tremendous benefit in us understanding ourselves as an institution, and the possible contradictions or holdups that can get, where an investigator can get caught between those two. But this has been very effective, so I just got up to make that practical comment.
Thank you.
I'd just like to point out that Guy and the Cleveland Clinic have been really at the forefront of all of this for a long time, so it's really wonderful that you have them on your panel, because even long before our redo of the regulation, they have been at the forefront of trying to stimulate the innovation still at the Cleveland Clinic while promoting best practices in managing financial conflicts of interest. So listen to this man. He's got a lot to say.
Hi, I'm Michelle McMurray-Heath. I'm Associate Director for Science at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the Food and Drug Administration. And it's interesting to me to see Dr. Lowe's Venn diagram, because we regulate most medical devices, but also diagnostic tests. And when you have a test that has high sensitivity and low specificity, it's used for screening, but not for diagnosis. And I think this idea of maybe coming up with a risk-based approach to dealing with conflicts of interest, it's something that we've been trying out at the Center for Devices, and I'll talk a little bit about it later on this afternoon, is something we should consider, because we regulate everything from tongue depressors to MRIs and heart valves, and the only way 2,000 people can oversee that vast array of complexity is to stratify risk, to triage what is particularly an important risk and what is probably not an important risk. And that, I think, needs to come to bear in our conflict of interest strategies as well, so that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and we're not making everyone do a huge amount of disclosure for something that might be very inconsequential in the long run.
I would say that in the case of our regulation, where the universities are, or the institutions are managing, are determining whether or not it's a financial conflict or risk, many of them have taken a risk-based approach. But I think having a risk-based approach requires data. And so without that data, it's hard to take that approach. So that's why I think the more that we collect data. But you're right, I think that's a great idea as far as an approach.
You know, the auditing profession has figured this out a long time ago, having just finished our audit and had the audit committee meeting. But you know, the auditors would say, we're going to audit you, and then we're going to spend a lot of our energy on these on these areas where there's a lot of risk for, if something goes wrong here, you're going to lose lots of money. We're not going to audit the $25 petty cash drawer. Even if someone was exhibiting malfeasance there, it's probably not worth worrying about. So I think this idea, and I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks later. Yes, please. Oh, Bernie wants to say.
Yeah, can I just add one thing? I like those comments a lot, and I just want to say that, you know, the clinical realm where I still work, if I have a very sensitive test that's not very specific, first I have to decide, do I want to order the test for this particular patient? But then if I do order it and it's positive, what am I going to do next? What is my strategy after that? So if I have all this disclosure and some of them are going to be positive, what do I do next? What are the questions I then ask that are much more specific, honed in to the kinds of relationships that present an unacceptably high risk of undue influence and bias? And we need to think through operationally what those next steps are, to talk about it in public and to come to some common agreement.
I'm Paul Billings. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Life Technologies. Life Technologies is a significant enabler worldwide of research. And I'd like to ask a question, make a comment. My question is there anything to be learned from how other countries have dealt with this issue? And I say that having recently returned from a tour of some hospitals in a very developed economy, where the floors of the hospital were crawling with medical device and pharmaceutical salespeople in the hospitals. Very different environment than one might experience in our hospitals in the United States at this time. Yet I'm not sure the problem is any different there. Maybe it is, but I wonder whether there's any objective evidence that there's a difference in how medical innovation, conflict of interest are handled in different environments of that sort. And my comment is, when Dr. Brem and I graduated from the same medical school in the same year, it was distinctly unusual for faculty members to have any relationship with industry. Dr. Folkman had a unique relationship with Monsanto. The inventor of the digitalis assay went to work in pharma. And those were very controversial events around the time that we became physicians. We've gone through a whole different cycle. There's a whole different kind of set of relationships. But it seems to me that the issue is still, there is the perception of conflict of interest. But the real problem is that there's not enough medical innovation. We need a more robust medical innovation pipeline. And because our patients demand it and our patients need it. And I know that I spend an enormous amount of time with compliance officers, with my legal department, trying to figure out pathways to support translational research. My company spends about between $300 and $400 million a year on R&D, much in partnering. And how we comply and all the time we waste trying to comply is a very significant issue.
Who has an international perspective on this?
I have a little international perspective, and it's not necessarily a positive one. I was recently in the Philippines, where the physicians come with shopping bags to fill up with samples from drug companies at every continuing education program. They do it because they want to, for the most part, they want to give their patients access to drugs that they otherwise can't afford. So there's clearly some important positive aspects to it. But their prescription behaviors are entirely dependent upon those relationships. That's where they learn about drugs. I was astounded at it, having lived through the transition that this country has made. So there are multiple different approaches to the problem, and in many of the countries that I've visited, these issues aren't being addressed at all, in part because the drugs that are available are restricted because of the costs. The marketing is expensive for a relatively small potential value in some of the countries, and yet in other countries like Indonesia, China, and India, the markets are so big that it influences everybody's behavior. So it's really difficult to extrapolate from one country to another and make any sense out of it. I think the other big issue that we're confronting is that many of the advances that we want to make in clinical and translational research require millions of patients. many more than we can have in the United States. And looking at personalized health from the Pacific Coast perspective, where we have a large Asian population, we have to look to Asia for those relationships. And then we start dealing with some of the regulatory requirements and restrictions of various countries, and the ability to control the intellectual property and potentially be able to build markets. And it's incredibly challenging. For example, China will not allow biospecimens to leave the country. So what they want to do is import our technology to be able to analyze the specimens, and once they do, they no longer need us. So it's figuring out how to build relationships that really allow us to gain the scientific knowledge to be able to build a product line that will address the issues that you've suggested. And I'm not sure there's any easy or straightforward answer or single answer to this problem.
Just mention that on a practical note, when we are dealing with our financial conflict of interest policies, it's rare that we have a country that comes in from outside the United States with a rigorous policy already in place. And sometimes it's absolutely the most rudimentary types of policies that you can imagine. So it's sort of the wild, wild west out there, and we have to try to implement something. But it's even more complicated because, in general, most of the other countries are sub-recipients of our awards, and that means that the prime is responsible for managing the conflicts of interest and making sure that those subcontractors or sub-awardees have conflict of interest policies, and that becomes even more complicated because all the universities and institutions are trying to figure out what's going on in the other countries so that they can say their policies are adequate, or they have to use our policies, or whatever it is they're going to do. So it's highly complicated when we have international researchers or other countries involved.
Yes.
Thank you all for a great panel. I'm Rasika Kalamegam from the American Association for Cancer Research. And the entire panel and the questioners also alluded to this, but I kind of want to get really down to the heart of the matter, which is we're talking about conflict of interest, we're talking about all these issues, and ultimately we're all talking about protecting the patient. So my question is, how do we incorporate the patient voice into all of these discussions? How do we figure out what it is that patients really want to know? And this is sort of going back to what Dr. Cohen talked about. You know, do I really want to know if my doctor got a pencil from a pharmaceutical company? But I think I would want to know if he's a stockholder in that company. So how do we figure out policies so we give the right information to the patient?
Yeah, this is a theme I hope we'll discuss throughout the afternoon, throughout the rest of the day. But I want to just say, disclosure policies aren't necessarily targeted to the individual patient. They may be for some patients, but I think the real value, for example, of a lot of these widespread public disclosures are not that my patients are going to go look it up. Some will, most won't, or many won't understand it. It's for researchers, investigative journalists, policymakers to look for patterns that apply more broadly. And I think that's the kind of value that we're most likely to see. Someone alluded before to these scorecards on coronary bypass operations and such. The value there is not so much that patients look to choose their hospital and surgeon, it's that the lower ranking institutions on their own institute quality improvement plans to sort of bring their complication rates down.
Just one additional perspective. I think one of the challenges that I have, and I'm sure Bernie has as well as a clinician, is understanding the patient's goals of care, because there's not a lot of time to establish those relationships, and that's the critical aspect of this whole issue. What is it that's important to the patient? What are they trying to accomplish? And then how can we together accomplish that goal? And to the extent that my providing insight into that has conflicts, I need to disclose them. To the extent that there are no conflicts, that may not be part of the dialogue. But I think, unfortunately, we don't have a good mechanism for addressing those issues. I'm not Marcus Welby. I haven't followed patients for their whole life. I didn't deliver their kids, and I don't have a long-standing relationship that tells me what's important to them. But it's critically important in figuring out whether to prescribe drugs, to prescribe surgery, or refer for surgery, or to have some other decision be the appropriate decision for the patient. Until we address that issue, outside of the scope of this conference, I think we're going to have a hard time addressing the disclosure conflict of interest issue at the patient level, as Bernie suggested.
And the comment I would make, coming from a point of view that's always worked on the consumer side of everything, on the patient side, is from the individual patient point of view and the family and the community, is understanding the relationship of medicine to commerce, that we do this in a market economy, and it has to be sustainable. And how do we figure out, you know, as several of you said, the drugs we take certainly got there because of commercial interest, and thank goodness they're there that we can have them. So I think for us it's about empowering individuals to start to understand that. And I think the root problem is way more fundamental. I don't think we're empowered as people to engage in our own health. And I think if we did, then we'd understand what parts of that might be influenced by conflict. And the other thing I would say is, I think that from the patient point of view too, the conflicts are not so much, certainly they could be financial, but as I listened to this conversation this morning, I'm struck again with the idea that we almost use financial conflict of interest as a surrogacy, and several of you pointed that out as well, because it's easier to measure. It's easier to say, how many stocks do I have, or have I been paid by a company, or is the pen I'm writing with, say, Genentech on it. It's much harder to say, what are my true biases, and even in fact, Bernie, do you have a pen with a...
This is from the physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment. Marketing their post-most programs with pens.
Looks like there's several pens up here that may be in conflict. But my point being that I think we want to look at deeper things. So when I began doing research on the disease my children have as a complete layperson, one of the things I noticed is that a researcher had said in 1988 that people with this disease, pseudoxanthoma elasticum, should not take calcium supplements, and they should also decrease calcium in their diet. He based that on his bias, essentially, having seen one person who had a low calcium diet and didn't progress with the disease. Well, we now have a whole generation of particularly women who did not eat enough or intake enough calcium, and are not only blind from the disease, which is the usual result, but also have severe debilitating osteoporosis. So his bias had nothing to do with money. Nobody was paying him, but his bias became a conflict, because then he also staked his reputation in further years, and still does to this day, by the way, in his retirement community, on that idea. So I think we want to find, to the idea of evidence, what other biomarkers do we have for what is true conflict?
Last comment.
I'm still Guy Chisholm. I jumped up because of the last questioner. I think it's really one of the most interesting things in all of the mix of this, is what do your patients want to know? And I don't know a whole lot about that, but I know a little bit. So after we were the first academic medical center to put our doctors' ties to industry on a public website. And after that, because of something the reporter asked me about that, I wanted to know what our patients thought. So we came up with 20 questions. So basically, what do you want to know about your doctor's ties to industry? And we had 1,400 patients out of 2,300 we'd approached, none of them Cleveland Clinic employees, who responded to that survey. And the data are very, very interesting from a number of points of view. I learned some of the interesting stuff in two patient focus groups in two of our regions that we conducted with 8 patients each who had filled out that survey, randomly selected. So there was some anecdotal stuff. So 50% of the patients responding wanted to know the amount of money that their doctors had from industry. So I asked them, why do you want to know this? Is it like you want to gossip with your neighbor about how much your urologist gets from whatever? So this woman who was, I think, an industry consultant business that she had, she leaned forward to me and she said something like this, and I think this is really an important comment. She said, if you tell me my doctor has a $12,000 consulting arrangement with a company, I think she's a player. I think she knows her stuff. I think she must be up to date. Otherwise, industry wouldn't be paying her for that. You tell me my doctor has a $100,000 consulting agreement with a company and I want more information, something's going on. And I think there is a threshold in all of our heads, and hers might be different than yours and mine, but above which there's suspicion. The other thing I learned from these patient focus groups is they have no clue of what we as academic medical centers do to identify, pursue, analyze, restrict activities of physicians and scientists because of these financial interests. And so one of the takeaways from this is that we need to do a better job, the IOM, the AAMC, the NIH, and all of our academic medical centers, in telling our patients why we do this and what we do about it to actually control it and to inhibit bias in data, in the well-being of research subjects, and in the decision-making around research. So I think there is a message coming from patients that we should pay attention to. And believe me, when we asked, do you think if Cleveland Clinic has a financial interest, not your doctor, but Cleveland Clinic has a financial interest in something being used in your treatment, do you want to know about it? 95% do. So I think there's a disclosure issue here that has to do with the right thing. One more comment. Would you visit a website where we disclose this? Most of them said, absolutely not. But the fact that you have a website like that tells me that you're doing something about it. For what it's worth.
Okay, rebuttal?
I'm afraid it's not a rebuttal, it's additional reinforcement. I'd say, and I'll get a chance to talk this afternoon, but at some point in our developing Gliadel, which was a treatment for brain tumors that we developed, after the studies were done, I had a relationship with the company that was then making it, and the IRB at Hopkins required a 3-paragraph addition to the consent saying that A, I had developed it, that there were patent issues, that I had a relationship with the company, and all this stuff, in offering the patient another opinion from another independent surgeon, and and so on and so forth, and offering them to take what I was saying about Gliadel with a grain of salt. I put that on the consents with some trepidation because I said, like, holy cow, what are people going to think of me? They trust me. I'm their doctor. I'm operating on them. But when they see all this transparency, if you will. So I was very surprised by the reaction. The reaction was, of course we get that. That's why you're the expert. You're the guy who has the most experience anybody in the world doing this type of procedure, and that's exactly why we came to you in the first place. So I think we underestimate what people, how they react to the revelations, if you will. And not one of those patients said, or maybe one or two did, and it was fine, said, yes, I'd like to see somebody else and sort of verify what you're recommending. And I was fine. But I think the transparency is very, very helpful. And it makes it so that nobody later comes back and says, holy cow, we had no idea how intimate your relationship was with the company. But what I've actually found is it didn't bother anybody, not one single patient. So I think I'd throw that into the mix as well. On the contrary, it actually reinforced them.
Thank you. In closing, I think we need to remember we are all walking cauldrons of bias and conflict. As somebody pointed out wisely, dollars are a very easy one to measure, but there are layers and layers and layers. Some of them academic, some of them psychiatric, some of them whatever. But this is this is part of the human experience. With that, we are done 5 minutes early. I think we should resume promptly at 11. So let's take a break right now.